Hello explorers, thanks for joining us again and welcome back to another exciting and informative video on our YouTube channel. If you are joining us for the first time, we want to thank you for watching. In this episode, we shall be looking how the United States of America can foster an African economic boom. The United States has a major opportunity at the moment. The continent of Africa needs investment, not just aid. Africa has become a playground recently for major superpowers in terms of economic development and juxtapositioning for strategic move. We shall be looking this into greater details. We will explore this like never before seen. So we encourage you to watch this video to the end for clarity and better understanding. So without any much delay, let's just dive straight into it. In the United States policy circle, Africa is generally viewed as a backwater, peripheral to the United States economy and security priorities. The statue is reflected in the U.S. diplomacy. The last visit by a United States president to an African country was then President Barack Obama's trip to Ethiopia in 2015. Contrast this with President Joe Biden's trip to Europe, Asia, and the Middle East just during the first year of his administration. The U.S. president was recently in Egypt, no doubt, but that was as a result of the climate change conference. Moving ahead, but now, the Chinese government has drastically enlarged its footprint in Africa. Washington policymakers are paying attention. Trade between China and African countries reached a historic high of $254 billion as of 2021. In comparison, trade between the United States and African countries declined from a peak of $142 billion in 2008 to just over $64 billion in 2021, and it now accounts for a mere 1.1% of U.S. global commerce. The Chinese government, moreover, has numerous energy, rails, and port projects across the continent. It has also donated vaccines and hamster suits to help countries in the continent of Africa combat COVID-19. In part to counter China's growing influence, the Biden administration has just unveiled a 21st century U.S. African partnership. Biden's strategies support a just African transition and region's post-pandemic economic recovery. It also emphasizes the importance of strong democratic institutions and transparent governance. To truly forgive the partnership with Africa, however, the United States should place economic diplomacy at the core of its engagement. This approach should draw on America's unparalleled strength in advancing technologies, private capital, while streamlining the U.S. visa system to allow for more business-to-business ties between the United States and the continent of Africa. An agenda of this sort will shore up Africa's economy and offer a long-term benefit to the United States. Africa's population is young and fast-growing than that of any continent around the world. The median age is 19 years old. In fact, it is expected that more than 2 billion people will reside on the continent by 2050. By the end of the century, rapidly growing African cities will constitute 13 of the world's 20 biggest urban areas. The region's latent growth potential is enormous. Companies that invest in Africa and countries that exercise patience in addressing governance challenges on the continent will gain access to the new markets and build political influence. If you consider the United States' leverage in the continent of Africa, to be sure, these expressed doubts about Africa's growth prospect can point to some disparaging statistics which makes no sense in different ways. If you consider those particular statistics, in drawing that, some will also have an impact in the continent of Africa and have some influence in the minds of investors. According to the World Bank, 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa could be home to over 90% of the world's poor by 2030. 20 of the world's 38 countries in fragile and conflict-affected situations are on the continent of Africa. 5 military coups took place there between 2021 to 2022. If you look at different areas, however, there are opportunities for investment that exist in the continent of Africa, and some countries have capitalized on this. Africa's growing digital economy is powered by Chinese digital infrastructure and mobile phone companies such as Huawei, Transition, and also ZTE. These Chinese companies have become market leaders on the continent, in large part because in early years of this century, US companies wrote off most Africans as too poor to afford mobile phones, looking at their strategic move in the continent. Similarly, African countries are now forging a variety of economic partnerships with companies and governments in places such as India, Russia, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, These deepening relationships are shaping the foreign policy of African governments. Witness how many countries in the region abstained on the United Nations resolution issued in March that condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. If you look at different areas, though the United States has this particular focus, but the U.S. policy on Africa is linked to the administration's effort to curb Chinese rise there. There will be a strong impetus to match Chinese investment in the continent of Africa, building high-speed railways, airport and power plants. Indeed, the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, launched in 2022 by G7 Summit to counter Chinese Belt and Road initiatives, was pitched as a way to launch energy, health and digital projects. Yet, similar infrastructure investment will not be the best use of U.S. public resources because those initiatives play to Beijing's strength. Instead, Washington should build on the United States' strength in advanced technologies and private capital, thereby aligning the United States' interests with economic development needs of the African countries. If you are new to this channel, we will encourage you to subscribe and share our videos with your different network. United States pharmaceutical companies are global leaders compared with similar entities in rival countries such as China, with guarantees from public agencies such as the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the Export-Import Banks of the United States, and also the United States Trade and Development Agency. American companies can invest in building out supply chains to produce medicines and medical equipment and vaccines in the African continent. Such investment will help strengthen vulnerability supply chains for medical products in Africa, improve the ability for local pharmaceutical industry to comply with international quantity standards, create jobs, and also reduce United States reliance on Chinese supplies. Unilaterally and via multilateral institutions such as World Banks at below market rates, African countries are advocating for reforming global finance to make it more equitable and also comparative in terms of the borrowing. The United States can also win more friends on the continent by backing this cause. The U.S. government can also support human capital development in African countries through exchange programs for medical professionals. If you look at different areas, another comparative advantage of the United States government is the ability to provide financing. It was, after all, the absence of Western financing for infrastructure in recent decades that propelled African countries to turn to China's bank. Now that African states need to invest around $50 billion per year in climate adoption, the United States should seize the opportunity and push multilateral development banks, European allies, to provide low-interest financing loans. These initiatives will align well with the need of most African countries. The region needs jobs for more than 11 million young people joining the labor market each year. Preceding for successful U.S. private sector investment in developing countries include places such as Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and a lot more, which were lifted into prosperity through such investment and remains reliable U.S. allies until today. If you look at the people-to-people contract and developing the skills and moving the United States strategic move into the continent, in pursuing this new strategies approach to Africa, the U.S. should expand its outreach to segments of African society that U.S. policymakers often overlooked. Some opinion survey shows that the United States favorability rating in the region to be tied with the even lagging that of China. The U.S. government already conducts civil society outreach in African countries through the International Visitors Leadership Program and the Yale Mandela Fellowship. These initiatives, however, target well-credentialed journalists and also employees of non-governmental organizations, omitting an important constituency: small business owners. Policies should be geared towards developing strong business ties between the United States, home to the world's wealthiest market economy, and Africa, the region to which highest rate of entrepreneurship in the world. A whopping 22% of the African working age population have started businesses. It is common to encounter a middle-class African trader or an entrepreneur on a flight to Dubai or Beijing traveling to source apparel, electronics and so forth, and heavy industrial machinery. In fact, Dubai has become a business capital for Africa, with an over 21,000 African companies headquartered in the UAE. The soaring volumes of African-Chinese trade, meanwhile, are mostly a result of the transcontinental ties between thousands of hardworking small-scale Africans business and Chinese entrepreneurs. Looking at other perspective, the United States African small business links, in contrast, remains plenty. The most obvious way to develop most ties will be to streamline the United States visa system, changing U.S. domestic policies, the impact of COVID-19, and the bureaucratic inertias that create a serious backlog for processing in non-immigration visas. This especially is true in African countries. The wait time to secure an appointment for a visit visa in the United States Embassy in Ghana, for example, Nigeria, Kenya, can exceed 2 years. This wait time is contributing to a growing perception amongst African future tycoons and decision makers that the United States is distant and inaccessible. In looking at different ways, it is not just the Biden administration that needs to refocus its African policy. U.S. congressional representatives are pursuing initiatives that overlaps in ways that are not complementary. The Prosper African Act aims to codify interagencies, co-effort and promote facilities increase U.S. African trade and investment. The country malign Russian activities in African Act, meanwhile, would hold accountable African governments and their officials who are complicit in aiding Russia's malign influence and activities on the continent. No such counterpart bills exist for any other regions, even though India and Gulf Arab countries such as the United Arab Emirates maintain strong economic ties with Russia. The result is that the United States is seeking to resuscitate declining trade and investment relations with African countries, while punishing those same countries for exercising their sovereign right to interact with other countries, albeit a problematic one. The United States, despite helping Africans with regards to other areas, still has a narrow focus on humanitarian needs, can overlook how much Africa has offered the United States in terms of new markets, growth opportunities and geopolitical alliance. Africa is not a peripheral region. What happens in African countries will increasingly shape the rest of the world. The international partners that help African countries overcome some of their screaming, intractable challenges and unlock their latent potentials will reap significant economic policy gains. China, Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, and other countries are attuned to this reality to realize the vision of the 21st century partnership outlined in the Biden administration. African strategic and economic policy should be at the core front of the United States policy in Africa. It is wise for the United States to focus or refocus its strategy on how to operate and deal with African countries. Most African countries are looking for investment, not just aid. They are looking at how to strategize their economies, create jobs for their own people, and grow their economies in several ways. Africa is not what it used to be 20-30 years ago. Africa is a continent with huge opportunity, and now we are looking on how the continent is going to be coming out straight from the COVID-19 challenges, and Africa is open for partnership and businesses. If the United States of America is not yet listening to these particular challenges and refocusing its strategies, then African countries will be moving forward to the east and tying their relationship. I want to thank you for watching The Explorer. If you are new here, we encourage you to check some of our informative video on this YouTube channel. We are looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Have a good day. Bye-bye.